Hello guys and welcome back to another video. Now I'm just going to let some Counter-Strike deathmatch play in the background, as that's basically all the clips I've actually got left at the moment, because I haven't had a great deal of time to play some more multiplayer games. There isn't a game called Anno 2070, which isn't particularly entertaining to watch, so I'd rather you watch me either fail a Counter-Strike or play at least some sort of moderately interesting game in the background while I talk over top of it. Anyway, I'm going to talk in this video a little bit about the current state of processors, overclocking them, which processors can be overclocked, and the recent changes Intel's making to their Skylake series of processors, where manufacturers of motherboards such as Asus, Supermicro, companies like that have all been making a series of motherboards that are designed to overclock the non-K overclockable chips using the base clock or BCLK multiplier in the BIOS. This is actually being shut down by Intel, and it's been confirmed in a number of sources. I'll leave a link to a couple of them down in the description, that they are going to update the microarchitecture, or something along those lines, of the processors to disable the ability to change the base clock and overclock them via doing that instead. Though I've never been much of a fan of changing the base clock on a processor at all, mainly because it can also have some weird effects with, say, supports memory timings. In fact, if I try to do it on my 2500K, it changes my memory timings and it doesn't allow my computer to actually boot. So obviously there's a little bit of a difference between Sandy Bridge architecture but overclocking the base clock and Skylake, which is probably quite apparent because it is completely different architecture and it is much newer. But on the AMD side, anything that's labeled Black Edition is an unlocked overclockable processor, which is 90% of their processors, it seems. I mean, my 6100, my brother's 4100, my mate's 6300, someone else's 6350, have all been overclockable chips. I mean, they're part of the FX line, which we're getting a AM4 socket in maybe this year, beginning of next year. I don't know the actual timing on when the next AMD motherboards and CPUs release, but apparently they're supposed to be supporting DDR4 as well, which is a much needed update to the AMD, and I really do hope that the current generation, or the next generation, codename Zen, AMD processors are actually a lot better than the current options that we have available to us. So, yes. Anyway, for just general games, if you're playing games like Counter-Strike, Battlefield, just your average games, then you don't really need a processor that can overclock. Yes, games like Battlefield will load up the processor when it loads the map. So your CPU will be doing the processing for the first sort of initial load, and then it doesn't have to do a great deal of calculations after that. However, if you're playing a game where it's got maybe a load of people, like the Armor series, or anything that sort of uses Bohemia Interactive's shitty little game engine that can't use a graphics card for shit, then yeah, it's going to be very CPU bound. Other games are going to be CPU bound. When you're loading players, things like MMO RPGs or MMOs, such as World of Warcraft, Star Wars: The Old Republic, those are a couple of the games I've played. They use a CPU a lot to render the players and render the world, and things like The Witcher and Skyrim will all be more CPU bound than GPU bound, as your CPU has to do the rendering for the world rather than the graphics card, which can be quite taxing on processors. I mean, most modern quad cores should be able to be handling modern games fine. I mean, if you really want to make sure that your processor's fine, then you can look at some benchmarks and reviews to see how they change depending on how their clock speed changes. Most modern processors also have a turbo boost feature, which, once they're using a certain amount of cores, the clock speed of the processor will actually increase. Most processors do this over less number of cores, so they don't do it over all 4 cores or all 6 cores. They tend to do it over 2 or 3 cores. So the less cores that are being used, the higher the other ones will turbo. Now, you can overclock this turbo mode by going into the BIOS and changing the frequency it turbos to, and normally the motherboard or the processor, or both, will calculate the voltage needed to hit that clock speed at that temperature as well. So as long as you've got the adequate cooling, you should be able to technically get your processors to boost to higher clock speeds. That's what I used to do on my AMD processor before I got a decent cooler, and I actually just decided to constantly run it at 4.2 gigahertz. With my Intel processor, my Core i5 2500K, I've got it cooled by a Corsair H100i. I've got that overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz at 1.3 volts. Now that is not a constant overclock, meaning the processor itself well, actually, if it's idling, it will reduce its clock down to 1.6 gigahertz, which in some cases has maybe, possibly with a very small chance, actually make the processor perform worse at a start before it starts going up to that clock speed. I haven't really tested this out, but it's nice to, when I'm idling, to have a lower clock speed, which in turn lowers the temperatures because it's not using as much voltage to keep that 4.5 gigahertz overclock stable, which is my reasoning for doing that. I want to be able to keep my computer very quiet while still being able to play my games and not hear the fans ramp up too much. But I don't keep that overclock on most games. In fact, Counter-Strike only goes to about 3.3 gigahertz, which is its normal clock speed. When I'm in the deathmatch, it will go to 4.5 because it's rendering more players. Because once again, Counter-Strike is not very GPU bound. It's quite CPU bound, but the game isn't very hard to run. So yeah. My graphics card in this game gets used about 20 or 30%. My processor's pinned up towards 50 or more percentage. Percentage? Is that a word? Maybe. I doubt it. But that is sort of the gist of it, really. You don't need a very powerful processor to be playing games. I wouldn't go lower than I wouldn't go lower than a quad core, though. Because when you start getting into the hyper-threaded i3s and stuff like that, it's going to be a little bit janky, and you'll be encountering other bottlenecks, such as your processor not being as fast enough to keep up with your graphics card, which is plenty fine in my case with my Core i5 2500K and my GTX 760. I'm pretty sure there's no bottleneck there, especially when I'm playing games like Star Wars Battlefront and Battlefield 4. My frame rates very rarely drop in those games. In fact, Star Wars Battlefront, I actually get, if I unlimit my frames per second and I run it on medium to high, maybe with a mixture of ultra settings, I can get over 100 frames per second in that game, which on certain maps with certain player counts, because the player count in Battlefront is less than it is in Battlefield, as you get 20v20 40-man servers instead of 32 versus 32 64-man servers. And the tick rate of the servers is actually less, which in turn does impact performance. Which is also a reason why there is no 128-tick valved servers on Counter-Strike. It's because the higher tick rate actually will impact performance on lower-end machines. So computers that are running maybe a slightly higher-end graphics card with a lower-end processor, like a dual-core processor or a low-end quad-core processor, will actually experience worse performance in higher hertz servers, which is sort of where the counter-argument saying that you could use a better processor comes in. But if you've only got a very limited budget and you want a processor that can overclock, and you want a processor that will last you a decent amount of time, something like a Core i5 2500K, or a Core i7 2600K, or even the 3570K and the 3770K, those older generations, the second and third generations Intel Core i5s, are still very good at gaming. I'm running a 2500K. I ditched my 6100 not too long ago, I think middle of last year. I went to the 2500K. Saw a big performance improvement over my AMD processor in almost all my tasks, and the processor only cost me £70, which would be $130 maybe? I don't know the exact conversion rate. But you don't need a modern CPU, you don't need a brand new CPU to play games. You can get an older generation Core i5 that's overclockable with on like a motherboard that might support it. That would be the hard part finding, say for 1155, it would be a lot harder to find a motherboard that will support overclocking and not be broken. So maybe 4th generation 4690K, 4790K and 4770K and whatever the other i5 is. They'll still do great for gaming if you really want to overclock. I mean, you can get some great deals on motherboards and processors now, but if you're not going to overclock, then you don't need to spend the extra money on a motherboard and a processor to overclock. If you want to, or you want to in the future, then you might want to really look into investing in that. I got lucky with the motherboard I picked, so that's what I was happy with. And I picked these up, I've overclocked them, and I'm getting great performance, and I'm pretty sure I won't have to swap out my 2500K for another processor for quite a long time. I will probably go through multiple graphics cards before needing to finally update my platform. I mean, I've got 12 gigabytes of DDR3 memory as well, which is plenty for modern games. I would recommend around about 8 gigabytes at least, sort of for gaming nowadays, because more and more games are using more memory nowadays. But anyways, this video is coming to a close, so I thank you for watching. Please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.